Okay, welcome back everybody. We haven't been doing this for a year. So today we are going to continue to study the 22nd verse of the 9th chapter of the Megillah. And in many ways, some of the things we'll study tonight are a continuation of where we left off a year ago. And some of them are very new. Before I begin, I want to gratefully acknowledge the sponsorship. This evening's class is dedicated to Ili Nishmas, Shmuel Nachum ben Moshe, the Neshama should have an Aliyah, and may the Neshama have nachas from the Torah that we study together tonight, both here in person and around the world. And you know, these are the kind of gifts that inspire happiness for Neshamas on high. When Torah is studied and their Neshama is mentioned and thought of. So I called tonight's class Gifts That Inspire Happiness because we're going to focus on an element in the 22nd verse of the 9th chapter of the Megillah, which is an important element within the framework of the observance of Purim. And this has a lot to do with understanding really what's behind the observances and its methodologies. So I think to do this right, let me tell you what Pasuk Chav Beis says. Just review the 22nd verse of the 9th chapter, and of course everybody who's here has a Megillah in front of them, and I encourage them to, if you have a Megillah wherever you are, to open up a Megillah and take a look. From verse 20 onward, the Megillah begins to record how the festival was formally enacted, how it became Purim for posterity. Prior to the 20th verse, what we have is a narrative, a description of Purim celebrations, but these were very dynamic celebrations. These were reactionary celebrations. Like if you look in verse 17, 18, and 19, it tells you about the days that the people found relief. So they battled on the 13th and found relief on the 14th. And then the Jews who had gathered in Shushan, they battled on the 13th and the 14th, and they only had respite on the 15th. And that's why the village Jews, so to speak, the Yehudim HaProzim, who lived in unwalled towns and cities, they celebrate on the 14th day of Adar, and the people in Shushan were celebrating on the 15th day of Adar. But all of this is being conveyed to us in dynamic fashion. If you look at, for example, verse 18, it says, V'hayehudim asher b'Shushan nikalu b'shlei shasar. They gathered, they united, and they did what they had to do to defend themselves. Al kein haYehudim haProzim hayeshvim. We're talking about, in a dynamic way, the people who were making the festivities on the 14th day, or those who were making the festivities on the 15th day. And then from verse 20 and onward, the Megillah kind of shifts into not simply a record of what happened then, but how did Purim actually achieve its eternity? How did it become an annual celebration forever? And we talked a lot about it in previous episodes. It's not only during our exilic days, but the festival of Purim will shine brightly and its joy will resonate even after Mashiach comes. So how does it happen? And the answer is because Mordechai recorded these events. And then Mordechai not only records these events, which is the beginning of verse 20, Vayichtiv Mordechai, but in verse 21 we say, Lekayem Aleihim, to uphold, to affirm. Lihiyos oisim, this is futuristic, so that they will make or uphold these days, namely the 14th and the 15th day of Adar, which were the very same days that the Jewish people had relief or respite from their enemies. And that's the verses we studied in the previous episode. We studied verse 20, verse 21, and we started verse 22, and we said that the festivities in today's day and age are Kayomim asher nochu bahem haYehudim. Like the days, it's like the days, meaning on the same days, that the Jewish people had respite that first year when they were delivered from the machinations of the Hamanites. And then, very interestingly, verse 22 starts off by talking about days, and the days are the 14th or the 15th, or according to some, the 13th, which is Ta'anit Esther, and then the days that follow, which are days of great rejoicing. But v'hachodesh asher nepach lehem miyogin l'simcha. We suddenly emphasize the month that was transformed from mourning into joy, from agony from grief into joy, from mourning to festivity, from misery into unbridled happiness. So in this month, which was transformed, miyogin l'simcha u'me'eva l'yom tov, so in this month, la'asot otam yemei mishta v'simcha, that these days should be made, the people should make these days for posterity, as days of feasting, as days of joy. And a day in which they would send food portions to each other, and a day in which there would be gifts to those who are destitute. Now, from verse 20 to verse 22, we hear about Purim's enactment. But, Mordechai can make enactments. If the Jewish people don't accept it, it doesn't work. As the expression in the Talmud goes, Ein melech b'lo yam. There is no sovereign without a nation that follows him. And we know that during the days of Ezra, the scribe, who was like a little Moses of sorts, who led the Jewish people back to Eretz Yisrael for the second time, he really is the one who spearheads what we, the Jewish people, call the second coming. That means our coming to Israel. He made a number of enactments. And the Sanhedrin can make enactments. They become halachically binding. Unless we find out that it never stuck. So if the Sanhedrin makes an enactment, and then we find out that the people never actually went ahead and did what the Sanhedrin wanted, the enactment doesn't mean anything. You can't legislate from above. There has to be a groundswell of support. Which may sound kind of odd because the Torah is legislated from a higher place. Yes, of course, but the Torah comes from God directly, and incidentally, God made sure to get our buy-in before he gave us the Torah. That was a very important part of it, because God could give us a Torah, and if we would reject the Torah, there would be a problem. Oh, by the way, there was a bit of a problem. We'll talk about that later on in this class. The Jewish people kind of got cold feet, and they, after having enthusiastically responded, Naseh v'nishma, yes, we're all in, we're going to do whatever you want, and they said, maybe we shouldn't exactly rush into this. And then we have this expression that our rabbis use, kofa aleim har kegigas, where God, let's just say, puts them in an overwhelming situation. And that kind of makes a problem. Makes a problem in the language of the Gemara. This is like a disclaimer. Because if the people didn't wholeheartedly embrace and accept, are they really responsible? And when did we wholeheartedly embrace and accept? And the answer is Purim. Which, as you'll see, is kind of how Purim is the climax. It's the end of a very long story that starts when we leave Mitzrayim. So we have to have the people's buy-in. And in fact, verse 23 tells us, accepted, v'kibel haYehudim es asher hechelu lasos. And we're going to talk a lot about verse 23, Be'ezrat Hashem, when we get to it. That class is going to be called Accepted, and really, why did they accept it? All the Jewish people, everybody. Not like in the days of Hanukkah, where most of the Jewish people were not part of the program. And the Jews who were observant accepted it, sure. They were the ones who were all fired up and fought for their freedom and liberty and independence and ability to serve Hashem. And what happened, unfortunately, is that the other assimilated Jews just kind of fell away. or their children became Baalei Tshuva and returned to the Jewish people. But here in Purim, the entire nation was engaged and involved and committed. So they all had to accept. And it makes Purim a singular phenomenon where the entire nation accepts upon themselves everybody, from what you might call in today's vernacular secular, unaffiliated, to the extremely pious. Getting all the Jews to agree on anything is a minor miracle, or maybe not so minor. So this is a big deal. Now this is an overview. So I've given you an overview. I've talked to you about what happens in the verses prior to verse 20, and then in the verses subsequent to verse 22. And verse 20 to 22 is about the enactment. So in the previous episode, we talked about this. We spent quite a bit of time discussing how it was and why it was that Mordechai enacted in the way he enacted. And of course, later on we're going to talk about Esther's role in all of this, which is extremely significant. Extremely significant, not only in the salvation of the Jewish people, but her role is pivotal in the acceptance of the Jewish people. We will get there. So what are we going to do today? So today we're going to go back to verse 22, and we're really going to talk about three things today. And the three things we're going to talk about is as follows. I'm trying to simplify this. I spend more time actually thinking about what not to include in tonight's class because I saw so many things and I've absorbed so much information, and I don't want to overwhelm everybody. So I'm actually trying to kind of simplify, to categorize this and simplify it so you can gain the maximum out of this class. That's what I'm trying to do. And I'm not sure, in fact, I'm pretty sure we're not going to finish verse 22 today, because there's a whole element of verse 22 that we're not going to deal with, and that's the drinking element, the intoxication element. It does come from verse 22. We're not going to deal with that, because that's a subject in and of itself. Here's the three things we're going to deal with. Number one, we're going to return to this very odd conjunction of days, and then a month that gets transformed, and then back to days of festivity and rejoicing. Why are we talking about a month? Why is there a discussion about a month? We talked about this in the previous episode. Tonight I'm going to share something really like mind-blowing. It gives you a cosmic view of Purim that's, I think, like a paradigm shift. So that's the first thing we're going to talk about. What is the business of this month? HaChodesh Asher Nepach, a subject that we've addressed and we're going to address again today. But the reason we're going to address it is not only to kind of answer, so why does it say the month? The reason is because the way to understand this verse is by understanding why it says a month. Once we understand why the month is inserted, we'll understand this verse. Otherwise, the verse doesn't make sense. Days, month, days. But there's something extremely profound being conveyed to us with this business of HaChodesh Asher Nepach, the month of transformation. Month of transformation. Okay, so let's file that away. We're going to deal with month of transformation, and we have a thesis of transformation that is going to open things up for us. That's number one. Number two, we're going to deal with the fact that these observances seem to be mentioned prior to verse 20. Before Mordechai is doing enactments, we already hear the term Yom Mishteh V'Simcha. Here it says Yomei Mishteh V'Simcha. So we hear this term already. And very interestingly, we also hear the term of Chodesh Simcha U'Mishteh. It's going to rotate it. So it's not the first time we're hearing about this. And the really interesting thing is that if we go back a verse earlier, we hear about the Mishloach Manot as well, which is very interesting. It's very interesting. The end of verse 19, it says they are Mishteh V'Simcha U'Mishloach Manot Ish L'Re'eu. So we hear about some of what we're talking about, but not all of what we're talking about, because suddenly we get introduced to Matanot LeEvyonim. what happens in verse 18 and 19, and what happens in verse 22. How did Matanot LeEvyonim get incorporated? What's the difference between what we read before and what we read now? Is there a difference? So that's the second point we're going to discuss. And the third thing we're going to discuss is, of course, the name of tonight's class, and that is Gifts That Inspire Happiness. Because we're going to talk about the gifts. The Yemei Mishta V'Simcha is the source of the Purim, what seems to be excessive drinking, and we're going to deal with that. But it's also a definition of these days. And these Yemei Mishta V'Simcha, which is not an act, but a day of, is somehow expressed with gifts to one another and gifts to the poor. Food portions to one another, gifts to the poor. What is that? We got Rosh Hashanah, we have Yom Kippur, we have Pesach, we have Shavuot, we have Sukkot. There's no other Yom Tov where we have a mandate of giving food parcels to somebody else. How did that become the defining observance of Purim? Why? There are many times during the course of the year where we emphasize the importance of tzedakah. And to be sure, tzedakah is always an important mitzvah to do. But at the same time, as the Ma'am Lois says, quoting the Ozni Yeshua, he says, Ein b'chol yemot hashana k'mo Purim. There's something about this day and gifts to the poor, I guess what people call alms or charity, shemarbim by b'tzedakah u'b'gemilas chasadim, that there's the volume, the level of kindness, of aid and assistance to others who are in need is unparalleled. So for every Yom Tov, we emphasize the concept of tzedakah. Even Hanukkah in the Shulchan Aruch, it says we should try to give more tzedakah, and we know there's customs like Hanukkah Gel, but it's not a mitzvah. On Yemei Pagra, on important days, whether important days in your personal life like your birthday or your wedding anniversary, whether important days in the community life or life cycle or calendar, it's always good to give tzedakah. That's the Jewish way to do things. But here it's a mitzvah. It's actually obligatory to the point that there's like a minimum that everybody is required to satisfy. Like you have to satisfy the minimum. Why is like this holiday? How did that become the observance for Purim? So those are the three things we're going to deal with. And in the next episode, with Hashem's help, we're going to stay in verse 22 for another episode, and we're going to talk about the Mishta V'Simcha. We'll talk about that the drinking of wine and alcohol, and like, what is that even like? Well, sounds totally out of sorts with what most of us know about Yiddishkeit. So does that make sense? Am I clear? Yeah. Okay. So let's go then to the first issue. We start off Kayomim Asher Nachu, like the days, and then we right away kind of move into V'hachodesh Asher Nepach Lahem, the month that was transformed. What does that mean? In the previous episode, I shared with you that the Talmud Yerushalmi says, really, you can read the Megillah all month. And the Shulchan Aruch talks about this, even though nobody does it. But there's actually a discussion about the whole month being different. Why is that brought up? What difference does it make if it's the whole month or not the whole month? And in the previous episode, and I strongly encourage you to go back and watch these because they're very informative, I think. We talked about this beautiful thesis that's developed by the Rebbe, where the Rebbe focuses on the words of the Gemara that describes how Haman, may his name be blotted out, sought to schedule his genocide for the most propitious time, or finding the most favorable conditions, and he chooses Adar, and this is the perfect month. So the day is less important than the month, but the month was the big deal, right? Because Moshe Rabbeinu dies in this month. But he doesn't schedule it for the 7th of Adar. He's still doing a lot of reasons. 13th is, that's pretty good. Like some of the Mefarshim point out, the 13th day of Adar was the last day of Moshe's Shiva. because the 14th already was the day after. So he was like kind of still happy. And we said that the month of Adar, therefore, has mazel because Moshe not only passes on this day, but Moshe Rabbeinu was born in this day. And as the Talmud Yerushalmi richly illustrates, on the day when a person is born, their mazel is very strong. So because Moshe Rabbeinu represents the entirety of the Jewish people, and because he's born in this month, not just this day, because it's not the day of Moshe's birth, it's the 7th of Adar, but it's the month in which he's born, so it's very mazaldik. And it suffices the whole month with a uplifting, propitious kind of energy for good things. But the month looked very bad for the Jewish people. So it's HaChodesh HaShaneh Pachlev. And this is what we talked about, how it's the month in general. So I discovered subsequent a fascinating edited talk of the Rebbe. I don't know why I just discovered it. I should have known this. But anyway, the Rebbe, in really one of the last talks he gave about Purim, this is Shabbos Parshas Truma, just the beginning of the month of Adar, the year is 1991. Shortly before the next Purim, the Rebbe was unfortunately already suffered a stroke. And the Rebbe talks about the ruling, says since we're in the month of Adar, our sages say, and this is quoted in halachic prose, Mishenichnas Adar, from when Adar begins, Marbim B'Simcha, Marbim, we increase. We increase. In other words, there's a riboy, there's an addition of joy in this month, the whole month, which eclipses the joy that a person is supposed to feel in all the months of the year. Just want to see if there are any questions. So Zalman, would you consider the month that is transformed because it became a holiday? Well, the whole month didn't become a holiday, right? And the verse starts talking by days, so why do we have to talk about a month? That's number one. Mar Cheshvan is bittersweet. That's actually factually incorrect. You'll forgive me. That's a urban legend that Mar Cheshvan, that Mar means bitter. Mar Cheshvan is it's not Hebrew actually. But the relationship is Kimar Midli, like water. So it's a month of water, actually. And the name of the month is Bull, which means like Mabul and deluge and rain. So it's the idea of that being bitter is not necessarily accurate. Purim didn't have any holidays, and it got a holiday. Yeah, that's cute, but it doesn't make the month, and it certainly doesn't make it the most joyous, most amazing month of the year. But anyway, I refer you to the previous episode, and which I know you were watching. So if you go over that, you'll see what I mean. So the Rebbe says the following. This is really, really fascinating. So let's put on our seatbelts, and I'll try to make it simple. The Rebbe says that with regard to the festival of Purim, as I mentioned, the Jewish people accepted the Torah the first time around under some duress, and as such, there was a disclaimer. But when Purim came along, and we could have opted out, but we didn't. This was the kiyum, this was the affirmation of Matan Torah. As our sages tell us, it's a famous statement made in the Gemara Masechet Shabbat, in Masechet Shabbat on page 88 in Daf Peches. The Gemara over there says, on the pasuk Kimu v'kiblu haYehudim, Kimu mashe kiblu kvar. On a literal level, it sounds like they affirmed and accepted upon themselves what Mordechai wanted them to affirm and accept, namely to observe the holiday of Purim. But in fact, there's the homiletic interpretation. The deeper meaning is that they accepted that which they affirmed that which they had already accepted. So they had accepted the Torah well over 1,000 years earlier, but now they affirmed it. Because at the time of Matan Torah, as our sages tell us, Kof aleim har kigigis. Literally, God held a mountain over them. It's not understood to be literally a mountain. That's a medrash, and medrashim are not literally; they're metaphorical. So the concept of held a mountain over them is like it says, Tzidkoscha keharekil. Hashem's righteousness and Hashem's kindness is like a mountain. And Hashem, it represents ahava, it represents love. The Alter Rebbe explains in Torah that God swept us off our feet. He revealed a tremendous amount of love to us, and we just were like we swooned. So we said, yes, whatever you say, God. But really, we were kind of checked out. We were just overwhelmed by the moment, and we didn't have our wits about us, per se. And because of this, the Gemara goes on to say, Mikan Medor Rabba Le'eraisa. This is a great big disclaimer. And Rashi says, a disclaimer means Shekibluha ba'ainas, that we were overwhelmed. We didn't do this with full mind and heart. But although that was the case, Hoidu Hadar Kibluha, pardon me, subsequently we did accept it wholeheartedly, knowing exactly what we were getting into. And this was in the time of Achashverosh, and as Rashi says, Me'ahavat hanes, because there was a great love engendered by the miracle, and this miracle, the miracle that happened, brought forth a profusion of spirituality from the core of our being, and we made that decision that we couldn't envision life any other way. We want to be connected to Hashem. Yes, we want Hashem's Torah. So the Rebbe says, okay, let's try to understand this. Me'ahavat hanes. So it was a great miracle, and God showed us a miracle, and the miracle really inspired us. So the Rebbe says, tell me, the Pesach miracle wasn't inspirational? I mean, if you want to talk about miracles and miracles, like which miracle is more inspiring or more the wow factor, Pesach is like miles ahead. It's eons ahead, like miracle after miracle after miracle after miracle, from the plagues to the splitting of the sea to the manna that falls. I mean, it's like unbelievable. We're living in a totally supernatural reality, and we're experiencing all kinds of revelation and divinity and God's closeness. So, if miracles bring forth love or reveal our core, why wouldn't Pesach have done that? Why wouldn't Passover's miracles do that? What did Purim's miracles have that Passover's miracles didn't have? And why is it that only in the time of Purim that's now this represents a full transformation? This represents the Jewish people's absolute commitment. So the Rebbe says a really, really fascinating thing. He says there is something about Purim that is unparalleled in Torah literature, in Jewish history, and really in the spiritual schematic of our faith. This is something that's only to be found in the holiday of Purim. And the Rebbe draws on a statement that the Alter Rebbe makes in a mimer, in a Hasidic discourse, that's found in Torah Ora, Megillat Esther. If anybody wants to look inside, it's on Daf Tzadik Dalad, which would be the equivalent of page 94 in the Hebrew letters. It's in the second column. So he says, when Mashiach will come, then the world will be changed forever. And that's called ithapcha. That's called transformation. But until Mashiach comes, when we have forces of darkness or evil or things that get in the way of God's plan, the best we can do is crush, remove, subdue, restrain. This is the bad stuff. So the bad stuff, you cast it aside. You uproot it. And in every deliverance that we as a nation experienced, we had the cruel, vicious taskmasters of Egypt destroyed. So they were cast aside. And then we came to Canaan, and there were people stood in our way, and Hashem smote mighty kings, it says. But the world didn't love us. The world didn't change. It's just that the enemies of the Jewish people kind of went into the dark corners because they didn't have opportunity. And they bade their time, and then they came out later on. time and again. But something very different happened on Purim, because Purim, says the Alter Rebbe, is like a foretaste of a messianic reality. Why? Because in the Ness of Purim, Nishapech Leiv Achashverosh Latov. Achashverosh was a vicious anti-Semite. He was. When Haman came along and he said, "My dear king, we have a Jewish problem. I'd like to propose a final solution." Achashverosh said, "I like it. Continue." Haman said, "I'm ready to pay. I know there'll be a loss of revenue." Achashverosh said, "You know what? Who cares about the money? If you can get rid of these people forever, I'd be eternally grateful. Here's my signet ring. Go do as you please." I mean, that's a modern restatement of what actually happened. So the Alter Rebbe says, "Oisoi ha'pe'atzmai," that very same mouth from which came odious, hateful statements, allowing Haman full reign and the ability to plan genocide, that same mouth came, the same mouth that said, "V'ha'am," and the nation, "Lasei slay, kitayv beinecha," do as you please. Hu atzmai, that very same Achashverosh said, "Va'atem kisvola Yehudim kitayv beinechem," tells Esther and Mordechai, you write to those Jewish people. You tell them to defend themselves, as you please. Alter Rebbe says, this is ishapcha chashecha l'nahira. The very source of darkness became a source of light. The source of hate became a source of sympathy, of empathy, even love. It's like an unparalleled thing. From the Pharaoh to Antiochus, when we had evil enemies who stood in our way, we thank God when our evil enemies were destroyed. Never once do we have an instance where the same enemy who sought to stamp out and to liberate our people became the very same individual who aided and assisted and showered us with love. It never happened. Not before and not after. And the Alter Rebbe sees in this something very redemptive, something very, very extraordinary. So restating this idea in the edited Sefer HaSichos from Shabbos Parshas Truma, Beis Adar of the year Tafshin Aleph, 1991, the Rebbe says, Purim represents the idea of ishapcha chashecha l'nahira. Darkness itself is transformed into light. As per the expression in the beginning of the 9th chapter of Megillat Esther, v'nahapachu. Everything got turned inside out. Total transformation. Transformation is the story of Purim. I think I shared this before. I'm going to share it anyway because it's a childhood memory. So when you're traumatized as a child, you remember. If you go back to your earliest memories are things that had a very, very strong, like something that really shook you up. Either a tremendous fear or a tremendous concern or anxiety. These are the things that actually stay with you. So I have a memory, and I don't know when it is. I don't know if I was 7 or 9 or 10. I don't know. But it's the first time I actually remember hearing the Rebbe say something, and I remember his words. And nobody else seems to remember this, but I don't think I could have imagined this. So I have this memory sitting on my father's lap at the Farbrengen, and the Rebbe says that when Mashiach will come, steht as ha'choshech atzma yor, that darkness itself will illuminate. Darkness itself will resonate photonically. And then the Rebbe said something which I found so traumatic, because he said he didn't know something. And I don't know, I was raised, the Rebbe knows everything. He said, Vadas meint, veis keine nicht. What that means, what does it mean that darkness illuminates? Turning the lights on is not darkness illuminating. When you turn the lights on, the darkness is gone. Ma'at doiche, harbe choshech, a little bit of light chases away a lot of darkness. That's the nature of light dispels darkness. What does it mean that darkness illuminates? Most of us tend to think of darkness as the absence of light. So what are you talking about, like a black hole? Like negative matter? It illuminates? Like it actually swallows photons. It doesn't even allow photonic expression, dark matter. Well, what even does that mean? It's like words. And the Rebbe said, what that means, nobody knows. The Rebbe said, I myself don't know what it means. And I just remember as a child, that was like, what? The Rebbe doesn't know something? So it's a concept. It's a concept that we don't have a literal understanding of. We can have paradigms. So Achashverosh's change of heart, that the same person, the same individual, who burned with such a hatred that he was prepared to look the other way. First of all, he had enormous economic loss. The Jewish people were, in many ways, a driving force in the economy of the country. It was a huge country. Jewish people were very successful at the time. They were overrepresented in many areas of achievement that had a lot to do with the local economy. And suddenly losing all these people was leave a tremendous void. This is not actually a logical thing. Who really knows? But they say that had Hitler, may his name be blotted out for eternity, had he not killed all the Jews or obsessed over killing Jews and focused on the war, he could have dominated the whole world. Who knows? Terrifying thought. So Achashverosh is a man he hears somebody propose genocide. He says, we're going to kill a couple of million people in one day. It's going to wipe a people off the face of the earth. We're going to hunt every last one down. We're going to murder everybody, man, woman, and child. Every baby. Everybody's going to be murdered in cold blood. And Achashverosh says, yeah, I'm kind of okay with that, sure. As you please. It's like astounding, the depth of such depravity. It's like an abyss. The same person becomes the greatest patron of the Jewish people. The same person. You can call him insane if you want, but we don't have an indication that he's insane. He's certainly an extremely egocentric individual who's fanatically focused on himself. If you want to give him a condition, he's certainly a narcissist on steroids, but he was not an insane person. This guy came out of nowhere to become the mightiest emperor in the world. Total transformation. How about Pesach? The Rebbe says, well, if you look at Pesach, the Pharaoh sent the Jewish people away, pleaded with them to leave, and a few days later, it says, Ne'apach libai, his heart bounced right back to where it was. And he told his people, let's go after them. We'll bring them back, dead or alive. They're not going to leave this country. And what happens? It happens is Hashem takes care of the problem, so to speak. And God drowns them in the Red Sea. We do nothing. That's called, in Zoharic language, iskafia, crushing the forces of darkness. So what does this mean conceptually? If you want to talk, let's not get obsessed with the details of bad people and lives lost. Let's talk about this on a conceptual level. So the Rebbe says that if you want to put it in different words, let's talk about the Jewish people's transformation from a slave nation to becoming an enlightened people. A people of wisdom, of literacy, of education, of morality. That's what we're supposed to be. So we become changed. Hashem says, you're going to become a mamlechet kohanim goy kadosh, becoming a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. How does that happen? Did we affect inner change? Or did God impose change upon us? Was it by virtue of extraordinary circumstances that we were transformed? Or was it that we rose in an extraordinary way and transformed ourselves? The answer obviously is God imposed change upon us. In the language that we use to describe the Exodus. Nigla aleihem melech malchei hamlochim hakadosh baruch hu u'ga'olam. This is the liturgy of the Haggadah that we say on Pesach night. God reveals himself, and God, by virtue of revelation, changes us. So anything that stands in its way, obviously you turn a very bright light on, darkness recedes. It's dispelled. But we didn't really change, at least not on our own accord. Whereas in the time of Purim, the miracle could not have been metaphorized as a bright light because it was entirely concealed. In fact, one can read the Megillah. If you read it out of order, you won't even notice a miracle. You have to kind of put all the pieces together to realize a pattern of a miracle. We call it a nes melubish b'teva. Everything just happened to unfold when it unfolded, and that was like extraordinary. So there was no wow moment, and yet we changed. We changed. We decided that we were going to re-embrace our Jewish values. We, the Jewish people at the time, who did not listen to Mordechai, who placed our trust in a foreign monarch, in a foreign government, that mocked and denigrated everything we believed in, that used the vessels of the Beit HaMikdash to make this grand big ball to celebrate foreign alien deities to us. We went along with that. We said, well, you have to solicit the patronage of the monarch, of the sovereign. So you violate the Torah a little. I mean, after all, you got to do what you got to do. That's basically what we said. And then we changed. We were faced with these unbelievable genocidal plans that Haman hatched, and we all did tshuva, and we remained loyal in a steadfast way. So on Pesach, we changed on Pesach. We said yes, but that was imposed. It didn't come from below. There wasn't a groundswell of transformation. It was legislated. We were told how things were going to be, so to speak. Here, we changed. So imagine you have this very charismatic teacher, and he or she comes into the classroom and knows how to manipulate, for lack of a better word, the students and get them to be the best students they could be. Even though they're not really excited about or interested in learning, but they want to please this teacher. There are such teachers, extremely charismatic. There's like almost a magnetism about them. So the kids fall into step. It's a wise teacher, and he or she knows how to find the troublemakers and co-opt them into the teacher's cause. And it's a very successful classroom. And then the teacher walks out, and the classroom is like a jungle again. But imagine if the teacher could affect the students to the point that even if there's no teacher, the students are still behaving and actually interested in learning on their own. You would say, now that is real change. Because that change came from within the recipient. It wasn't imposed. It was planted and nurtured. It's real change. It's lasting change. The miracles of Pesach and what they subsequently engendered, namely mass revelation at Sinai, were all legislated or imposed from a higher place. So we said yes, but it's as if we did so under duress or pressure. Masha'enkein la'achar nes Purim. Here when we affirmed, we decided, me'ahavas hanes, but there was a love, it's a different kind of miracle. It's a miracle where we had to seek out the face of Hashem. It's a miracle where we had to look to find the presence of Hashem. It's a miracle that in the end we were saved and we saw transformation, but that happened after we were prepared to sacrifice our very lives. We were not going to abandon our Jewishness, even if it would enable us to save ourselves. So what we have here, because we have a miracle which is embodied in the laws of nature, what we have here is an inner transformation. And that the Rebbe says is why the celebration of Purim is so extraordinary. That it's actually beyond definition, but I'm going to come back to that. Be'ezrat Hashem, we'll come back to the rest of this transformative thesis in our next episode. So going now moving forward to what we just said here. HaChodesh asher nepach lahem Purim is not just a day of a miracle. The entire month represents a paradigm shift. Because it was in this month that we experienced that turnover. For some Jews on the 13th, miracles on the 14th, we celebrated on the 15th. Already from the 11th of Adar, one can start to read the Megillah. There's a Purim energy throughout this whole month because it isn't the celebration of a day. It's the celebration of a transformation. It's a celebration of the Jewish people, if you will, turning the corner. A paradigm shift in our national saga. It is celebrated on a particular day, in a particular way, depending on who you are, or more like depending on where you live, a walled city, or if you're a proverbial villager. So if you're a regular Purim or Shushan Purim. So the details of the observance, that can vary. But what this represents is a massive transformation. And this is how we understand the verse. So what is Mordechai trying to enact? What is Mordechai trying to get at here? What Mordechai was trying to enable the Jewish people was to be able to hold on to the magic of what happened for posterity, to be able to reach deep inside themselves on an annual basis, to be able to benefit from this event forever. That it shouldn't have been a thing that happened in a time and then just faded into the vapor of history. But instead, it should be the thing that transforms Jewish life from here and onward. That's really what Purim is about. So when we're talking about verse 22, and we say that Mordechai wants to now enact Purim. Vayichtav Mordechai, going back to verse 20. Mordechai writes these letters, and he sends them to all of the Jewish people living in King Achashverosh's provinces. Those both near and far, and he's sending them an instruction. He says, L'kayim aleim, we need to uphold just as it was celebrated the first year. What we need to do now, he says, is hold on to this energy and this magic and this message. And we need to celebrate it every single year so that what happened on Purim didn't just happen once, but it remains with us. So what we're going to try to do now is to hold on to the Purim energy. That's why we're celebrating Purim on an annual basis. So whether we celebrate it on this day or celebrate it on that day or on both days, the point is that in order to reenact or to kind of implant into our DNA forever what happened at the time of Purim, we have to celebrate Kayomim, like the days Asher Nochu Behem Yehudim, that our ancestors had respite, because we don't celebrate wars, as we talked about in the previous episode. We celebrate respite, celebrate the freedom to be able to do what Hashem wants us to do, not when we have to fight for it. War is hell and horrible, and it's nothing to celebrate. So we're going to, like those days, V'hachodesh, the transformation. This is the most important element here. The transformation, the month of transformation. This whole period of time. It's not a day. It's a period of time. It represents an idea, a concept that's supposed to and did become part of our Jewish DNA forever. That this is the month of transformation. Now, you want to talk about the technicalities of the transformation? The technicality of the transformation was such that it went miyogoin l'simcha, u'me'evel l'yomtev. That it went from grief to joy, that it went from mourning to festivity. But this is a paradigm. It's a paradigm. It's a representation of the change that happened. So I saw something very interesting that, the Mefarshim ask, why is this even an emphasis? Why we talked about the V'nahapoch. This has been mentioned time and again. Why, when it comes to enactment, do we have to re-emphasize what was to know what is? So the Megillah Sefer says, because how would we appreciate what happened if we don't talk about what could have happened? You have to remind everybody, it was going to be really bad. Not just a little bad, really bad. It wasn't just going to be sad. There was going to be grief. It wasn't just going to be a bad day. It was going to be mourning, death, destruction. And look at the extremes. Okay, I mean, there's an element of truth that there's certain extremes that are being discussed, and we have to frame it and highlight it so we actually appreciate what happened. But it's far more, actually. The point here is transformation, and transformation of darkness into light. Where can you see transformation of darkness into light? We don't know what that means. Turning the lights on is not transforming darkness into light. Turning the lights on is dispelling the darkness. But if you have grief, and now the grief is replaced with joy, the energy, the pent-up energy, the extreme energy that was previously expressed as grief is all of a sudden it's a far greater joy. It's an unbridled joy. When people come out of that kind of situation, it's not the same joy as if nothing had happened. When there was days of mourning, a time of mourning, that becomes a time of festivity. It doesn't say, well, we're going to mourn and now we're not mourning anymore. We're going to be dead and now we're alive. Okay, that's fine. That's not what happened. It didn't become no more mourning or no more grief. It became a time of extraordinary joy and festivity. It's a transformation. That's the paradigm of transformation that we're talking about over here. So this kind of sets the stage for the next words of verse 22. So what are the next words? Where do we go from here? La'asot otam yemei mishta v'simcha. To make them days of feasting and days of joy. Now, to be sure, the Gemara does tell us on these very words, la'asot otam yemei mishta v'simcha, that this is the idea of feasting. This is the verse that speaks to the Purim Seudah, and as Reb Saadia Gaon writes very clearly in his Pirush HaAruch, he says that the pshat of these words are shasiyah. This refers to drinking. It's about drinking wine. And I'm not talking about that today. I'm not going to focus on that. We're going to go back to that. Because it doesn't only have to mean drinking, because then it would say a time to drink. It doesn't say just a time to drink or that you should drink on Purim. It says Yemei Simcha. And Yemei Simcha indicates more than simply the idea of that, yes, we say L'chaim on Purim and in a very unusual way. In fact, as the Rebbe once put it, when we talk about the words Yemei Mishta V'Simcha, days, not an act of Mishta V'Simcha, but rather days of Mishta V'Simcha, he says it's understood that the chiyuv, that the halachic obligation of Mishta and Simcha is actually applicable to the entire 24 hours of Purim. Not that you can fulfill the mitzvah of eating the meal necessarily at night, but the whole time of Purim is a time to rejoice. So it's more than just about a meal, even though the Gemara says, and we're going to talk about this in Masechet Megillah on page 7, side B, the Gemara says in these words, La'asot otam yemei mishta, that it says, Chayev inish libesumi b'puria, a person is obligated to imbibe in wine on Purim, and the Gemara uses extraordinary description of how much wine or how cloudy one's perception has to become. But the point is that it doesn't just say we should drink wine. It says Yemei Mishta V'Simcha. And Yemei Mishta V'Simcha means, as the Rebbe said, this helps us understand that we're talking about an obligation, Shachol B'chol Rega. It's applicable each moment of Purim. And there's a question in the Gemara, for example, when you talk about a lulav and the etrog, which are the four kinds that we take on Purim, on Sukkot, pardon me. So we talk about the palm branch and the citron and the myrtle and the willows. So the question the Gemara discusses, is it iskatzoi lemitzvasoi or iskatzoi lekula yoma? Is it set aside for the entirety of the day or just for the performance of his mitzvah? And this has halachic bearing. It's in Masechet Sukkot in page 26. It has a halachic bearing of whether something is designated, because once it's designated for a certain purpose, then it can't be used for other things. So the point is that according to the opinion that it's not just for a mitzvah, but it's all day, the idea is that a person can fulfill a mitzvah constantly whenever he's holding a lulav and esrog. And indeed, we have records of, in antiquity, Jewish people who walk around the whole day holding a lulav and esrog. They didn't just hold the four kinds together for a moment in the morning or maybe do their morning prayers. A whole day, wherever they go, they take the lulav and esrog with them. And so, just like we have an obligation to study Torah. Somebody says, I studied Torah already. I already did my 5 minutes. I'm done. I can do whatever I want now. We say, a Jew is always supposed to be studying Torah. If you have the time, study Torah. That's what you're supposed to do. You only can get away with a small allotted period when you don't have any other time. So this is not like the reading of the Megillah, which is a mitzvah on Purim. There's no mitzvah to hear the Megillah again and again and again and again and again during the day of Purim. It's a mitzvah to hear the Megillah at night, and it's a mitzvah to hear the Megillah in the morning or sometime during the course of the day. It's not a mitzvah to hear the Megillah all day. It's a mitzvah to be happy all day and all night. Purim is a time to be happy. Purim is a time to rejoice. The specifics of Chayev Inish Libsumi takes place at a certain point in the festivities of Purim. But the Yemei Mishteh Simcha is, our sages ordained that this should be a day or days of rejoicing. Meaning, it's important to have a sense of happiness and joy about your Avodat Hashem all the time. It's much, much more important during the month of Adar, and most important on the days of Purim. It's Yemei Mishteh V'Simcha. So why? Why? Because that's how we are capturing this transformative energy, that we have to transform things into joy. That was the transformation. On a very literal level, it went from grief to joy, from mourning to happiness. And the verse continues, and we say that this Yom Tov, that this celebration is Mishloach Manot Ish L'Re'eu U'Matanot Le'Avyonim. It happens in a manner of Mishloach Manot. It happens in a manner of gifts of food parcels to your fellow, and it happens in a way of gifts to the poor. So what does that even mean? So Skippy's asking, Zalman wants to know, where does the joy come from? Is it from the day itself? Is it tzedakah being done in the day? I'm glad you're asking that question, because that is precisely the question we're going to answer right now. This is going to be the focus now. The Alter Rebbe, and a little bit further in the Memorim of Megillat Esther, on page Tzadik Tes, which would equal 99, he says that the awakening that took place at the time of Purim, an awakening which was punctuated with Mesirat Nefesh, utter absolute devotion and sacrifice. So when we got to Torah, we said, Higdimu Nasal Nishma, but we said, yes, we will do. We were ready to put ourselves aside. But that was like, for a minute. And then we started getting cold feet. And then God overwhelmed us with all His glory, and we said, yes, I do. But in the time of Purim, the Alter Rebbe says, was Nisoider Behem Haratzim Va'ava. We awakened a sense of love and loyalty to God. We became really committed. That's the Hadar Kiblua. And that was Mesiras Nefesh. We were there with the stamina and the spiritual courage to stay the course. And even though this was a time of divine concealment. So this was almost like an awakening from below. We reached out to God. We became changed. We became changed. And that's why there's such an emphasis on this transformation. So, for example, the Maharal of Prague, in his commentary in the Megillah called Or Chadash, he says that we hear about two things. We hear about, in the language of the Megillah, that the transformation is Yagoin l'simcha and Eivel l'yom tov. What's the difference between grief to joy and mourning to festivity? And he actually suggests that the grief to joy is like grief is pain, like a bodily sensation almost. He said, and then we became joy. It's about a bodily reality, but he says that Purim represents much more than a bodily transformation or a sensation we could feel in a bodily way. Purim represents that we became transformed in a spiritual sense, that we became devoted to Hashem. The festivity is a festivity that comes from within our neshama. That's what happened. The question, of course, is how do we reclaim that? How do we reclaim this? So the Maharal of Prague says something quite fascinating. He says, so what is the mitzvah of Purim? More than any other time, you're giving these parcels, these food gifts. That's the big mitzvah, he says. Why is this? And here we're going to talk about the anatomy of the holiday itself by virtue of understanding the mechanics of the specific observance of the gifts that inspire happiness. He says, Purim represented a showdown between the Jewish people, Am Yisrael, and their arch enemy, who is Amalek. What does Amalek say? Amalek represents the idea of divisiveness, fragmentation. Every man for his own fate. This is Amalek's verbiage. Amalek's great-grandson, Hitlerites, that's what they had emblazoned in Auschwitz, each one to his own fate. Cruel, indifferent, selfish survival instinct. What's our response to that? We say that as long as Amalek is around, so God's name is, so to speak, not one. And the Jewish people focus on saying, Shema Yisrael Hashem Echad. We try to embody the idea of oneness, and Amalek gets in the way of that oneness. Amalek tried to divide us, to divide and conquer. And what we need to do to reclaim the magic of Purim is to work on erasing differences and nurturing togetherness. And the Maharal says this is precisely what the gifts are about. He says the gifts are about fostering unity amongst each other. In no other festival are we trying to reclaim what we became, how we behaved. We are observing the miracles that Hashem did for us. Here we did something. We came together. Nikhalu HaYehudim. The Jewish people congregated. We came together. And therefore, the observance of Purim, more so than any other time of the year, is to bring about a sense of oneness, and that's how we inspire happiness. Yir lahem chibur v'reyos gemura. By doing this, we will have a sense of absolute unity and oneness. And the Maharal says it's even more so with regard to gifts to the poor. But he says, when you're giving to the poor, he says the Evion feels desperate, impoverished. The taker doesn't feel good. The taker feels that he's receiving somebody else's largesse or kindness. And it's very important to do that and make sure that we take care of those who need. But at the end of the day, he says, the real complementary togetherness is when I don't need what you're giving me and you don't need what I'm giving you, but that doesn't make a difference. The fact that we're exchanging these gifts and we're giving each other nice things, it fosters a sense of unity amongst us. And he says, if you take a look at the story of Purim, Esther said, Lech knois es kol haYehudim. Go and gather all the Jewish people together. And what was the response? As we described this much later on in the 9th chapter, Nikhalu haYehudim. B'mesh Yisrael hem am echad. It was an embodiment of our oneness, our togetherness, our being able to transcend our differences and come together as one. And that's how we can overcome the Hamans. And that's how we are able to experience, when we have oneness amongst ourselves, a oneness with God as well. He says, Ubishvil kach. This is the reason, the Purim, befrat especially, zot ha-mitzvah mishloach manot. This is the mitzvah of Purim, the mitzvah of fostering unity. That's the mitzvah, because that's what we're trying to get back to. Because that's what this was about. That was the transformation at its core. And he says, this is the idea, the matanot evyonim, because it becomes clear that we're all kind of leaning on each other. Now, I want to share with you the fact that the Gemara, and this goes to on Daf Hey, the Gemara has like a discussion about Yom Tov. What is Yom Tov? He said, why wasn't there a Yom Tov? Why didn't they make this a Yom Tov? So the Gemara says in Masechet Megillah Daf Hey, the Gemara says like this. The Gemara says, it's prohibited to deliver eulogies, to fast, to do things that inspire sadness or moroseness on Purim. So the Gemara says this is something that the people accepted, kabilu alayu. The Jewish people accepted this. Melacha lo kabilu alayu. The prohibition of doing work, they didn't accept that. The Meikar in the beginning says the Gemara ksiv, simcha umishte v'yom tov. This is how the holiday was observed in that first year. If you go back to the verses, verse 18, verse 19, what did they do? Osim es yom haba asar of the month of Adar, simcha umishte v'yom tov. And the Gemara understands that mi'ikara simcha umishte v'yom tov. And the Gemara's understanding is that the Yom Tov meant no work, like in a real Yom Tov. Ulubasof, that was in that first year. They said, we're not going to work today. Nobody's going to work. Nobody's doing any creative work. It's like a Yom Tov for us today. But in the end, Ksiv, it says in our verse, in verse 22, La'asot otam yemei mishte v'simcha, it doesn't say Yom Tov. Ilo Yom Tov lo Ksiv. Yom Tov doesn't say. And the Mefarshim talk about this. Why? And there are a number of explanations, but a straightforward explanation is that Mordechai and Esther did not feel comfortable legislating a Yom Tov. Yom Tov is God legislates no work. They said, we're not going to decide there's no work. We're not going to create, can't replicate the Bible. God told us there's no work, there's no work. What we are going to be able to do is create happiness. Create joy. We're going to reclaim that magical joy that swept across our nation. We're going to reclaim that transformative experience. That's what we're going to reclaim. That's going to remain something that's here in a permanent way. The Manas Halevi, the author of the famous Lachadodi, in his commentary in the Megillah Manas Halevi, he says like this. He says, if you look at the verses, you'll see that there's disparity between the way the Bnei Shushan were keeping this festival and the way the Bnei HaPrazis, the villagers, were keeping this festival. He said there were two different schools of thought. In Shushan itself, they said the miracle was unbelievable. We have to have like a Yom Tov. But he said, the Bnei Shushan said we have to be joyous. We have to have days of simcha, but not a Yom Tov, not a Yom Tov. And the Yehudi HaPrazim, the Jews who lived outside of Shushan, who saw less of a miracle, they didn't agree. They said, what do you mean? You can't prohibit work. And they observed these days differently. The Shushanites who saw the miracle in a much more profound way, the other Jews who saw the miracle in a less intense way, all of whom experienced transformation, they observed the Yom Tov differently. Some were doing Mishloach Manot, that was the people in Shushan, and some outside of Shushan stopped working altogether and they had a full Yom Tov. So Mordechai and Esther understood that they needed to create what you call a compromise between these different schools of thought, between these competing desires to observe Purim. And so they created a hybrid of both organic celebrations. They said it's going to be days of Yemei Mishte v'Simcha, days of rejoicing. The Mishloach Manot is a beautiful idea, but in order to make it Yom Tov-like, we're going to add Matanot LeEvyonim. How does that make it Yom Tov-like? Because on a Yom Tov, the Torah says, you don't sit down to a Yom Tov table by yourself. You have to include those who are less fortunate. It's a very important element of celebrating Yom Tov. So they say there has to be this idea of Matanot that are given to Evyonim, and as the Rebbe once pointed out, it doesn't say tzedakah. It says a matana. A matana, the Gemara tells us that Ilay Yohivlei, Ilay Ovidlei Neichel Nafshe Yohivlei Matanta. If somebody doesn't do something for you, don't just give them a gift. A gift is an appreciation. So what the Chachamim legislated wasn't just tzedakah. They legislated show appreciation for the other, that you cherish him. You're not giving him because it's the right thing to do. You'll have more, he has less, you have to share. Show that you cherish, show that you care, show that you love. Even those who are destitute and less fortunate, and especially those who are destitute and less fortunate. And the point then is, the Manas HaLevi says, that we see how these gifts were given in a way to be able to bridge the gap and in some way to reclaim that original groundswell of happiness that swept across the Jewish people. As the Eshkol HaKofer puts it, he says, the truth is that in a time of Purim, we were all like aniyim, we were all like impoverished, we were all desperate. So let's remember how desperate we were. And when we were desperate, we needed God to be there for us. The way to remember that is to be there for those who are desperate. And he says, Lafisha Yisrael Am Echad Ba'aretz, because we are ultimately one nation, because we are a family, because we are able to transform and transcend the negative realities through our unity. So, and because we did that, because we came together, that's why Nigalu. And there he says, therefore, it's appropriate that we should be sending Mones, Ishler Yehu, and coming together, so to speak, as one. So in other words, these gifts were designed to actually inspire happiness, or to bring us back the original joy of Purim. Here's something interesting that the Ralbag says, Gersonides. Levi ben Gershon, in his commentary on Megillah, says that the Mishleach Manas are a siba l'ribui simcha. It actually causes joy. Because he says when everybody's going to give a gift, if you're going to gift, you want to make it nice, and of course, this is the custom of Jewish people. Mishloach manot are always like pretty little things. It's not just like a slab of bread and a piece of cheese, or a salami and a bagel. People make nice mishloach manot. And actually, I refer you back to customs and conventions. I give a whole class in this called party packages, Purim party packages. It says there's a whole element of sharing and giving. And because he says everybody is going to be yochin kol echad mehem matamim, everybody's going to be doing nice things for one another. So this brings about simcha, it brings about tainuk, it brings about joy, it brings about happiness, it brings about togetherness. And he says if we wouldn't have this legislated, it would never be in that fashion. And he says, what would have happened? People would say, this holiday isn't really biblical. It's not that important. How happy do you really have to be? It's not like God told us to be happy. He says, "Ulai maybe mipnei she'ena Torah mechayeves." The Torah doesn't mandate l'smoyach b'zeh hayom. Yekelu be'anoshim, they'll be lenient about it. V'lo yachinu, they will not prepare, so to speak, k'fi masharoy lahachn b'mei mishta v'simcha, for what has to be done. They wouldn't prepare a proper meal. And he says, therefore, if you got to give to somebody else, and you're going to make sure that those who are needy have, this actually creates the simcha. These are gifts that inspire the happiness. Here's a very, very interesting thought. What's the cause and what's the effect? It's kind of a question that the Rebbe asked once. He said, do we rejoice because it's a Yom Tif? Or it's inherently a day of joy because it's a day of simcha, that's why it's a Yom Tif. What causes what? Is it the joy that makes Yom Tif, or is it the Yom Tif that makes the joy? And the Rebbe suggested that this very question sets aside the celebration of Purim from the celebration of all other holidays. In the other festivals, we don't find the words Yemei Simcha, Yemei Mishta v'Simcha. They are festivals. The Torah mandates that they are festivals. The Torah says, Eila Mayadei Hashem. These are the days of Hashem. Because these are the days that Hashem made, so therefore, the Torah mandates that on days that Hashem made, We should, v'samachta b'chagecha. You should rejoice in your festival. Why should you rejoice? Because it's your festival. Because it's a festival, now go ahead and rejoice. However, on Purim, the Megillah says that it is Yemei Mishte v'simcha. Not because it's a festival, that's why we should rejoice. It was made as a day of joy. And because it's a day of joy, that's why it has to be, so to speak, observed as a festival. In other words, the joy here is the cause. And therefore, the purpose of these gifts is actually to bring forth that joy. They're gifts that inspire happiness or that nurture happiness. So what the Megillah is telling us here is that Mordechai understood that he had to create a mechanism by which we could curate and nurture this joy so that Purim could become a festival. And by virtue of this unity that we were able to experience, we were able to, if you will, achieve a taste of that inner transformation that had punctuated the Jewish people during Purim on that very first time. In the Rebbe's words, with regard to Mishloach Manot, the Rebbe said that these two mitzvahs specifically, and this is found in Likutei Sichos Chelik Beis, these two mitzvahs specifically really highlight and emphasize the connection that we all share with each other. Haman said, Yeshnei am echad, there is one nation, he said. They are mefuzar or mefered, they are disparate. No unity amongst them. And our response is, we are one nation. As we express this unity through the Mishloach Manot and the Matanot Le'Evyonim. And the Rebbe emphasized, as I mentioned before, the verbiage of Matanot Le'Evyonim rather than Tzedakah. So in summation and closing, what we see happening here is Mordechai brilliantly orchestrating the possibility or the mechanism by which we could experience a reclamation of the original transformation, and by going through, by nurturing that oneness, by, so to speak, bringing the mechanism that allows for this oneness to express itself. The oneness is inherent, but you have to find a way to bring it forth. By helping us curate and bring forth that oneness through the Mishloach Manot and Matanot Le'Evyonim, this is what Mordechai sought to do, and as we will learn, it was accepted. It was embraced by Am Yisrael, and the proof, as they say, is in the pudding. We continue to celebrate Purim, and ultimately, in the worst of times, we the Jewish people have always come together. May Hashem help us. We should come together for Yemei Mishte v'Simcha, not in worst of times, but in best of times. And the more unified we are, the more Purim energy we have, the more successful we will always be in warding off the threats to Am Yisrael, in building the Yiddishkeit that enables us to achieve our mission and our purpose. The Mirza Hashem takes us across the finish line to the time of Geula v'Yeshua, the true transformation that we will together experience with the coming of Mashiach. B'mheira u'b'yameinu amen. Thank you so much for joining. See you back next week.